people from the Moroccan community, young people, and they say, we're angry. And I ask them, why are you angry? We're discriminated in the labor market. Okay, that's true, but what is the problem of discrimination? We wanted to be treated as equals. Okay, now we have something in common. Because I, as a non-believer, want to be treated as equal by you. Are you willing to do that? To treat believers and non-believers as equals? Are you willing to treat women within your own community as equals? Then it becomes difficult, but they see the fairness of the argument. And in the long run, if people don't want to guarantee your freedom, how can you expect them to guarantee the freedom of who are denying their freedom? So, I think we have a problem in our majorities, we have a problem in our minorities, there's prejudice, definitely. I've been looking for words that are more subtle, like loss, unease, problems of adaptation, but yes, there are also forms of prejudice, and I can only fight the prejudice among the majority in my society if I confront at the same time the prejudice among minorities. If we take the idea of citizenship seriously, it goes beyond the idea of majority and minority. Because in the end, if you think of majorities and minorities as the defining characteristic of your society, you are stuck with the idea of tolerance. But tolerance is not equal rights. Tolerance is a majority tolerating a minority. I want to go beyond tolerance by saying people have equal rights, but also equal responsibilities. And that is what hurts, because it's asking a lot, but it's the only thing which in the end helps us, because we need common norms to be able to disagree in a meaningful way with each other. If we don't have common norms, and multiculturalism in the end says there's no such thing as a we, I think we cannot have a democracy without a we the Dutch, we the French, we the Poles, but then the we should broaden. It should be more inclusive. But there is no we without shared normative ideas. Not that many. Freedom of expression, freedom of religion. Few of those ideas, but they are fundamental. And if we don't share that common normative framework, I think we will not be able to progress beyond the conflict we are witnessing now. But reading migration history, shown in the film, I hope to visualize that we're already in the process of finding our way through conflicts to new forms of living together. So the mayor of Rotterdam, where the film ends, first generation Moroccan migrant, Muslim, leading the second largest city in the Netherlands. And being very critical, and I've been on tour with him many, many times. He's vilified by his own community because they think he has sold his soul. He's vilified by others, but he's leading the way forward. Thank you very much. I've been talking 15 minutes longer than I wanted to, but I hope there are objections or questions, whatever, criticisms, astonishment, everything is possible. Yeah, please.
Yes, I just want to thank you for the I am one of those Polish migrants. I'm working at this moment in Eindhoven for an international corporation headquartered in Amsterdam. So I can fully empathize with the story of many of those migrants. I also did it in the past, at the time when it was illegal, I mean before Poland joined the European Union. And I can fully agree with most of your arguments, except one, except the concept of the loss. Because nowadays, myself as a European citizen, just moving from one country to another, I don't really have a feeling that I'm losing something. So there are definitely people, who migrate somewhere and they still do not integrate or do not feel as a part of that society. But myself, I can feel, first of all, that I'm gaining a lot. Not my family, because actually I don't have family here anymore, but you know, my friends are benefiting from me being there. Very often, you know, I transfer lots of knowledge to them, I exchange my experiences from over there with them here, so they definitely benefit from that. I benefit from that, and you know, I think also Netherlands benefits from me as a high-skilled worker to help the company, which is going down to get back on course. So I never perceived, I love migration as an experience. Is, you know, it's like a major part of my life. I've been doing that since I'm 14 or 16. And I really love that, and I never felt that I'm losing something. So this is, you know, the point where I would disagree.
Yeah, but I think my story is basically about the large majority of migrants that are low-skilled. So of course there's high-skilled migration. The question, of course, do you see yourself as a migrant staying there, or do you still live the myth of return yourself? To the extent that you think I lived for a couple of years in the Netherlands, because I've lived for a couple of years in Poland. In 1980-81, I was correspondent here in Poland. I still know, without looking my way, downtown here in Warsaw. Before that I lived for 2 years in Paris. And I could repeat what you're saying. But that is, of course, not the reality of migration that I'm talking about, let's say, in the long run. And of course, the fraction of people, high-skilled people that migrate, because is really small, because migration is most of the time born out of need and necessity, because it's not easy. And I wonder how easy it will be, you know, if you really stay for a long time in the Netherlands, learning the language. Then of course it might already be, because if you work in an international company, you know, you speak probably English there most of the time, so you don't need much Dutch. But the moment you're going to see yourself as a citizen in the Netherlands, trying to influence things beyond your direct work situation, you run into all kinds of linguistic questions to begin with. So I think it's a bit more complex, even for myself, you know, living in not to speak about Warsaw in 1980, which was of course a very different reality, but even in France I found it not that easy to really socialize to begin with. People were rather close, you know, not on a basic level, but if you want to go a little bit further, then we ran into all kinds of blockades, which I think is part of the reality of migration. And I wasn't surprised myself in ending up in a community of Latin American immigrants in Paris. All kinds of fantastic love affairs, but that's a completely different story. No, but so I can understand that, you know, if I'm invited to an American university to teach there for 2 years, it's also a gain. But that's perhaps not directly, I think.
I would have another question, because I've been traveling a lot across Europe, and especially when it comes to Italy, I'm there almost every month. And you know, I also started to learn Italian a few months ago, and you know, I'm talking more and more to the Italians at the place, and I can notice that Italian, there is really a great pressure from the African immigrants when it comes to Italy. Some cities, especially the ones with harbor, they experience enormous pressure when it comes to, you know, to the waves of how many people are coming in there. Based on the research which you did, do you have any recipe for those countries? You know, how to deal with it nowadays? I mean, how to avoid the mistakes from the past? And what would be the model for Europe or European Union as such for the future? What should be this immigration model or migration model, the policy?
Yeah. I haven't spoken much about immigration. I've devoted most of my talk about integration, you know, what happens after people have arrived. But you're absolutely right in saying that it all starts with a clear idea about immigration. In my book, I've argued very much against the idea of migration being beyond control. There are many people who think of themselves as enlightened, who say we live in a world without borders, and border control is a very anachronistic, strange idea in a world of globalization. It's simply not true that you cannot control borders. It's a question, do you want to control borders? And if I talk with an alderman, for example, in a Dutch city, he can explain me exactly in what street most of the illegal migrants live. But they have some economic benefit, there is some negligence to the idea, let them rot in their own privacy. It sells itself to the world, you know, accepting illegal migrants as a very benign way of living. I don't think it is benign or social at all. But the reality is, of course, that border control, now with our common external borders, you could do more. Now we are in the grips of being taken hostage by cynical people who trade in humans. So this whole enterprise, Mare Nostrum in Italy, I think is deeply flawed, because human traffickers, they know that there will come a rescue operation. Now 150,000 people have been fished out of the waters of the Mediterranean, and they simply sent there, the boat is being sabotaged. And it's so I think we should begin there with asking ourselves, to what extent do we really want to contradict illegal immigration? What are the sources? How is it organized? What are we going to do against it? Secondly, what sort of migration policy do we need? I think we could look to Australia, Canada, the United States. We need skilled migrants, we need some unskilled migrants, but mostly we need skilled migration. And that is what we should organize. So labor migration is not a humanitarian obligation. There is a constant confusion between refugees, which I think is a humanitarian obligation, with all the moral contradictions it entails, because how are we going to judge whether someone is a genuine refugee or not? But anyway, I think that is a humanitarian obligation. But labor migration should be defined by the needs of the country of arrival, not by the needs of immigrants. I'm a bit harsh now and brutal, but I think that is, it's simply not a good idea to open yourself to forms of migration where you don't have employment for people. What's going to happen to them, to the children? So, the labor migration should be defined by the needs of the labor market where people are migrating into. That is, of course, very roughly speaking, you could nuance that to a great extent, but that is the basic thing. And we in Western Europe simply don't have a clear understanding of immigration, of the sort of immigration that we need. We need immigration, to some extent, but to define what sort of migration that we need and what sort of migration policy is helpful, most European countries are not doing that. And I think it's not beneficial, because a good immigration policy definitely helps in terms of integration. Because the fact that more than 90% of immigrants in New York are working, against 50% of the first generation in cities like Amsterdam. I mean, work, we can talk at length about civic courses and whatever you want to do, but work is, of course, the most simple way of finding your way in a society. You learn the language while you're working, you learn to meet other people, you get out of the house, you're not isolated. I mean, work is definitely one of the best and simplest ideas of integration. So the large amount of unemployment is, I think, not a very helpful reality. Yeah, sorry for the long answer. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for a very interesting lecture. And my question is, well, you said about multiculturalism, it was very inspiring and made me think a lot about it, because I remember very well when I was living in the UK, and there was whole discussions about multicultural Britain, but also when Chancellor Angela Merkel said that multiculturalism has failed. She's been heavily criticized on the basis that, yeah, she's not progressive enough, and she's very conservative herself. So I wonder what's your view. And I mean, I'm not sure whether she proposed anything
No,
more beyond that.
that is exactly my criticism. Some people think I'm too conservative, so I'm not the one to blame Angela Merkel or others. I don't think of myself as conservative, not at all, but anyway. I think the problem with Cameron and Sarkozy and Merkel, when they were saying multiculturalism has failed, was not that they said multiculturalism has failed, because I think it has failed, by and large, because that was the end of their argument. That is, of course, something you cannot do in a position as a prime minister or president, to say something has failed without opening a new horizon, then what to do. So that is why I continued after saying I don't think multiculturalism is the answer, to say what notions I have, what I would propose in terms of citizenship, of shared idea of citizenship, in a very concrete manner. How it should transform our welfare state, how it should transform our education, how it should reinforce or strengthen our sense of normative, of a normative community. But I think their problem was, you know, creating a void. Because after having declared that something failed, then of course the void was filled by populism. By people who came up with an answer and saying, we know what the answer is. Islam doesn't belong to France. You cannot be a French Muslim. That's a contradiction in terms. You cannot be a German Muslim. And that is the problem, that if you declare something bankrupt, especially in that sort of responsibility, then you have to open another horizon for people to explain then what binds us, what could bind us together. What could be a common understanding. And I think, you know, I've thought a long time about it, but the whole idea of saying, as multiculturalism does, there's no such thing as a we. We're all different. That's the only thing we have in common, our difference. I came across somebody of the Turkish community in the Netherlands, and he said to me, we, the Dutch, we have failed in Srebrenica. I don't know if you all know the story of Srebrenica, but let's suppose you do. And then, of course, it's interesting, because he said, as somebody with Turkish origin, he identified, he said, for me, we, the Dutch, we Dutch citizens, we should be ashamed of what happened. So the whole idea that the we that is implied in we the people is always only a source of pride. No, it can also be a source of shame. We can be ashamed of what happened in our country. But if there is no such thing as an identification, a sense of responsibility, and of course there is, emotionally speaking, you know, the Dutch reaction to the downing of this plane, if it would have been filled with Germans, of course there would have been 2 or 3 days of feeling of how sad it is for the Germans that they've lost them. Then it would have passed, and it would have been construed as a political question, geopolitics, whatever, but not the sense of emotional identification. But because they were Dutch citizens, there was a very strong sense of mourning, collective sense of mourning, and I thought it was great, because people showed their sense of being part of a wider community. Now, of course, these forms of identification can get an exclusive or aggressive or adversarial aspect, you know, that you identify so closely with being Polish that you push away others. But there is no need in that. You can also identify a sense of we, sometimes in terms of pride, being proud of something that happens, sometimes being ashamed, sometimes being angry, whatever, or sad. So for me, a living democracy cannot exist without, and it can perhaps evolve into we, the Europeans. I hope, but I don't see that much evidence of that for the time being. But let's not be too impatient. It's only 50 years now. So perhaps in 100 years we will share, in a broader sense, a sense of shame about Berlusconi, because we realize that Berlusconi is our politician, also in the Netherlands or in Poland. Or we feel a shared sense of pride when Donald Tusk becomes president of the European Union. I, having lost my heart in Poland, I feel this very strong reaction. For me, it was a fantastic symbol of change after 25 years of change. But I don't think that many Dutch people would have a very strong emotion by Donald Tusk and by what he represents. But anyway, that could evolve. But without that sense of a shared emotional space for the good, for the bad, there's no such thing as a living democracy. So all this willingness to deconstruct, to rip apart, without reassembling the idea of society, I think it comes very close to what Margaret Thatcher claimed one day when she said there's no such thing as a society. I think that is what multiculturalism could say. There's no such thing as a society in terms of a we. But I think it's a deep misunderstanding to look at societies through that prism. I was proud when this guy from even a conservative Muslim organization in the Netherlands, Turkish, from Mili Gurish, said to me, "We have failed in Srebrenica." Then I thought, really, that is what I would be looking for in the history of migration, that people start to say such things, even if it's painful, because it's of course an embarrassing and painful episode. But the we that was implied, I feel responsible for what happened there. That is what a democracy needs. One more other question, because I can see that it's getting late. Yeah? You? Both of you.
I have a question concerning also the integration part. I was wondering whether you said about that the multiculturalism isn't in fact possible. Like my professor at intercultural studies said, like multiculti isn't okay, and in fact it doesn't exist. But I was wondering whether the integration isn't in fact the third step or fourth step after the kind of the adaptation, but still the adaptation that needs to be done in much deeper level by the immigrants than by the country or the people who are living in the country. As I imagine, when you were saying that, for instance, at one point we need to change a law or we need to change some rules, whether it's school or other kind of schools. But to do that, I suppose that the country which hosts immigrants, they would adapt or change or integrate only the way they agree or they,
Yeah, but
right?
I mean, it's of course not a question, because there is a deep conflict going on, not only between migrants and the established population, but within this established population itself, within migrant communities, there's a conflict, there are lines of division and conflicts that are highly complex, but so we struggle, and there is a temptation, for example in the Netherlands, to not to live up to the idea of religious freedom. We have a party in our parliament, which is now 10% of the vote, was a little bit more before, in the previous election, and they simply say all mosques in the Netherlands should be closed. In my view, in deep contradiction with our constitution, but they say Islam is not a faith. It's a radical, fascist political ideology. It can't claim its right to religious freedom, because it's in the end a political persuasion. It has something to do with religion. But in the end, it's a threat because it's an illiberal ideology which undermines our liberal society. That is their argument. I think it's deeply flawed because it's something of an invention after 1400 years of history of Islam to suddenly discover that it's not a religion. That's a feat, I would say, but that's the way they argue. And I think there are quite a few people in the Netherlands, when it would come to a referendum, like in Switzerland, about forbidding, to forbid minarets being built in the public sphere as part of a mosque. That quite a few Dutch people would vote yes, we don't want that. So there is a temptation not to live up to basic ideas of our constitutional order of freedom of religion. And there's a temptation among quite a few people in the Muslim communities to claim freedoms, but not to share them with others. To vilify Jewish community, to vilify people with a Christian persuasion, to vilify certainly people without religion, homosexuals, whatever. So there's a deep intolerance among minorities against other minorities as well. And I never understood why we shouldn't speak about it. There's a deep paternalism hidden in those who say, yes, but can ask a lot of things from majorities, but minorities are vulnerable. We shouldn't confront them with all these questions and normative problems. They're vulnerable. No, they're citizens. They have a lot of rights. And if we don't address them as citizens, they're caught in a position of being tolerated forever. Because you deny responsibility by saying you shouldn't be confronted. And I think the problem that we face is a problem that we are struggling on all sides. What could unite us with all the diversity that belongs to an open society, which I take for granted, in a sense, that it belongs to an open society. But not everything that is diverse is worthwhile. Fanaticism is part of a diverse society, but it's not something you would embrace. So diversity, as Amartya Sen, the Indian-American philosopher and economist, said, it's an empty word, because it embraces everything. But there are forms of diversity that you want to fight against, that are a threat in an open society. And that is something we should be far more explicit about. Otherwise, the vacuum will be filled by others, which have very exclusionary ideas, which defines the idea of being Dutch, or being French, or being Polish in a far more narrow-minded way. So only if we propose a more liberal, open-minded idea, what it could mean to be a Dutch, French citizen. But the problem is that most of the centrist parties in our country don't have a proposition of what an immigrant society could be as a positive narrative. They are struggling, Not a very convincing idea of where it could lead to. Last question, I think, and then we'll call it a day.